Good day. As of the date of time of making this video, the situation on most of the battlefronts in Ukraine is relatively quiet. There have been Ukrainian attacks in the Krasny Liman area, which have achieved, so far as I can see, nothing whatsoever. There's been more Ukrainian attacks in northern Kherson region, which have also achieved very little up to this point. By the way, on the topic of the Kherson area, I've been reading reports now that the Russians have heavily echeloned the new defense line that they've created, which is much shorter than the old one, that the various Russian troops who were isolated from each other are now able to operate together, and that reserves have been brought up. And it seems overall and by and large that the Russians think that they have the situation in Kherson region at least under control. Well, that's what the Russians are saying. I don't know whether or not that is the case. But on one battlefront, we're now getting more and more news that in fact things are changing fast and perhaps even dramatically. And that battlefront is the one that never gets reported or discussed in the media in the West, which is the battle that is taking place in and around the town of Bakhmut in Donbass, in Donetsk region. Now, just to reiterate again, Bakhmut is a largish city. It has, within its metropolitan area, it has a population of around 100,000, or at least it did before the start of the conflict. If you take into account all the satellite towns around Bakhmut, you take the Bakhmut conurbation, in other words, it becomes a lot more than that. I've seen figures of up to 150,000 people mentioned. That's probably, by the way, substantially more than lived in all the territories that Ukraine has recaptured since the start of its offensive which began in late August. But perhaps more importantly, Bakhmut, so we repeatedly hear, is the linchpin of the entire Ukrainian defense system. In Donbass, it's an important road junction. All the roads apparently sort of connect there. And anyway, it's been a major fortified center for the Ukrainian military. Now, over the last 24 hours, I have seen a number of estimations of the Ukrainian forces, who are the size of the Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut city. And the figure that's been cited, and it seems to be supported by a itemization of the various military units that are supposed to be allegedly defending Bakhmut city. That figure, that number, is said to be around 30,000 men. 30,000 men defending a city which before the war had a population of around 100,000. So you can already see that this city, this large town, if you prefer, has become now almost a fortified area. It's become a kind of fortress rather than a city itself. But that figure of 30,000 is actually useful in order to make comparisons with the number of troops that Ukraine has been deploying in other places over the course of its offensive. So, the original offensive that Ukraine launched against Kherson region in late August, early September, the totality of the forces involved in that offensive was 25,000 men, 15,000 in the first strike force, the original strike force, another 10,000 in the follow-up strike force. And if you're talking about the offensive in Kharkiv region, as I've discussed, in several places. That involved around 9,000 men. The offensive that took place and which captured Krasny Liman or Liman involved apparently around 6,000 men. And the armored column that Ukraine deployed in Kherson region, which broke through the Russian defenses on the far eastern edge of Kherson region along the Dnieper River, and which drove down that asphalt road until it reached Duchany. I've seen an estimate that it numbered around 3,000 men, together with 150 armored vehicles. Now, if these figures are correct, and I've no reason to doubt them, then, of course, they are all less than the number of Ukrainian troops defending one place, which is Bakhmut city. Now, that perhaps gives one a reasonable insight into where the real weight of the battle in Ukraine is being fought. It is being fought, as has always been the case, throughout the start of the war in Donbass. That is where the heaviest fighting is taking place, and the main battle is in and around Bakhmut city at the present time, though also, it must be said, around Donetsk city as well, where the Russian, or perhaps I should say allied or pro-Russian forces have been steadily and incrementally, but methodically and slowly breaking through the various Ukrainian defense lines around Donbass city, working towards the settlement, the big settlement of Avdiivka, from where most of the shelling of Donetsk city by the Ukrainian military has been taking place. It's around that area where, so far as I can tell, most of the really intense fighting and the heaviest losses has been taking place. Now, a short time ago, about a week ago, I remember reading a bulletin put out by the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence. These are not usually very interesting or very helpful, but every so often they do give one a glimmer of insight about the situation. Anyway, this particular bulletin seemed surprised that the Russians, or the Russian command, was still focusing on Bakhmut city rather than redeploying forces who were continuing the offensive against Bakhmut city to defend places which were the target of the various Ukrainian offensives which we've seen unroll since the end of August. And that does make me wonder whether one of the purposes of these offensives was to get the Russians to loosen their grip on Bakhmut city. In other words, to put pressure on the Russians in various other areas of the front lines so that the Russians would be driven to divert forces from Bakhmut city into defending those other areas, enabling Ukraine to keep control of Bakhmut city. And the Ministry of Defense bulletin seemed somewhat baffled that the Russians had not done that. It wondered whether political factors might have been in play, whether there was some political reason why the Russians were focusing on Bakhmut city and not defending, not redeploying troops from Bakhmut city to defend against Ukrainian advances. And that makes me wonder, as I said, whether in fact part of the purpose of the offensives was to get the Russians to disperse their forces in that kind of a way. If that was the case, then obviously the Russians have not fallen for the bait. They've allowed the Ukrainians to make advances in various places, but that has not shaken their single-minded focus on taking Bakhmut city. Now, the interesting thing is that even as the Russians have not been redeploying forces from the siege of Bakhmut city or from the breaking up of the Ukrainian defenses around Donetsk city, Ukraine has been doing otherwise. Over the last few days, we've been getting an accumulation of reports which I can think one could say are now almost certainly true, that in order to maintain the momentum of its offensives, Ukraine has been pulling in troops to the area of these offensives from all sorts of other areas. So apparently the area along the Russian border in northern Ukraine around Chernigov and Sumy has been stripped of its defenses as troops have been redeployed from there to support the offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson. There's been reports that the Ukrainians have redeployed most of the defenses around Odessa to support these offensives as well. But perhaps most interestingly, the Ukrainians apparently also redeployed forces from Bakhmut city to support the offensive against Krasny Liman, and has recently been redeploying forces from Bakhmut city to support the offensives in Kherson as well. Which, by the way, if true, would imply that 1, 2, 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut city presumably numbered more than 30,000 men. Now, that weakening of the defense lines around Bakhmut city has enabled the pro-Russian forces, specifically the Wagner Group, whose precise number around Bakhmut city nobody has said, but which most accept is significantly less than the Ukrainian forces who are defending Bakhmut city. That has allowed the Wagner Group to press its offensive against Bakhmut city and now to capture more and more of the surrounding suburbs of Bakhmut city, tightening the ring that is gradually closing around this large Ukrainian force which is still defending Bakhmut city. And earlier today there were reports that Zaitsevo, an important suburb, has now been captured, and there's been a string of other places around Bakhmut city which the Wagner Group has apparently captured also. And it also seems that Wagner Group soldiers are now edging ever deeper into Bakhmut city itself, are starting to capture more ground within the residential areas, the central areas of Bakhmut city, and that Ukrainian forces, following the pattern previously established during the defenses of places like Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and other such places, far from doing what the Russians do in these kind of situations, instead of retreating and abandoning the defense of Bakhmut city as it becomes increasingly untenable, that they are instead withdrawing deeper into Bakhmut city in order to maintain the defense there. A sign, by the way, of how important Bakhmut city is seen by Ukraine. Well, that seems to me to be the major news from the battlefields at the moment. An interesting, perhaps even suggestive development. As I said, for the moment, Ukrainian offensives in other places seem to be at a standstill. The front lines, both in Kherson region and in Kharkiv region, seem to be essentially static. The Russians are talking about their defenses in these places hardening. well, we see over the next few days whether or not that does indeed turn out to be the case. And in addition to that, and moreover, if I can say, there is now growing concern amongst the Russian military blogging community, which perhaps reflects opinions on the part of the Russian military as well, that as well as these offensives in Kherson region and Kharkiv region, Ukraine may be about to try a third offensive, this time from the city of Zaporozhye towards Crimea, towards the important town of Melitopol, apparently with the intention of breaking the Russian land bridge from Donbass, from Ukraine and from Russia and through Donbass to Crimea, and perhaps splitting the Russian forces in two, those in Kherson and those further east. I have to say, it seems a wild plan to me, but it may explain, in fact probably goes very far to explain, why, if this is a Ukrainian plan, if there is a real Ukrainian plan to do this, the Russians have been holding back their reserves. Why these major forces that have been gathering in Belgorod, opposite Kharkiv, and also in Crimea, have not so far been activated. It may be that the Russians still think that Ukraine has some offensive up its sleeve, perhaps in Zaporozhye, and they don't want to commit these reserves too early because they feel that they might need these reserves to deal with whatever it is that the Ukrainians might be planning in Zaporozhye region. And by the way, on that point, if it's true that there are 20,000 Russian troops, armored troops in Zaporozhye, in Crimea, that would put them in a good place to counter any Ukrainian offensive south from Zaporozhye intended to cut the land bridge and split the Russian forces. I would add, by the way, that Zaporozhye region also has some of the best Russian military units stationed there, members of Russia's naval infantry, the Russian Marines, the Chechen forces, around 10,000 of them, are also apparently located principally around there, and there's large numbers of forces there. So I would have thought that any Ukrainian offensive in this area has little prospect of success. But who knows? Perhaps the Ukrainians think otherwise. Perhaps they have reasons to think otherwise. We will see what Ukraine plans over the next couple of days and weeks. And lastly, and most interestingly, there's a very interesting piece of information which just came through over the last few hours, which is that the Ukraine is now having increasing problems with its Starlink system. The Ukrainians have been heavily reliant upon Elon Musk's Starlink satellite array to preserve communications. Well, it seems the Starlink system is now increasingly breaking down, and there are lots of discussions about why that is. And it's now, as of the moment of making of this video, this issue of the problems with the Starlink system is now the lead story in the Financial Times, which suggests that there's growing concern about this. And the theory, the worry, I suspect, on Ukraine's part and on the part of the Western powers, is that the Russians have found some means to interfere with the effective operation of the Starlink system. Given how dependent Ukraine has become on the Starlink system for its military communications, if that is indeed the case, and I'm not a technical person, I can't even begin to speculate about that, then I think that would be a very serious problem indeed. So that's where we are on the military battlefields. I'm going to say now something else. There is growing bafflement. Maybe it's my own bafflement that is now transmitting itself, but I've been reading lots of Russian commentaries here, mainly on Telegram channels, but I understand that there's also some unease starting to reflect itself on Russian mainstream media and on Russian social media about the fact that the Kremlin is remaining incredibly reticent about what is going on. Putin himself had a meeting a few days ago with a group of Russian teachers. He spoke about his confidence that the situation on the front lines would stabilize soon. He didn't explain how that would happen. And then he went on to talk about the great importance of continuing to respect Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian traditions in the areas, the liberated areas, as he referred to them, in the 4 regions which are now formally part of Russia. There's been no announcements, however, of any major personnel changes in the Russian military. There's been no announcement of a declaration of a counter-terrorist operation in substitution for the special military operation, even though that was anticipated by by Sergei Aksyonov, who is the head of the Crimean government, which is a constituent government of Russia. There's been certainly no increase in tempo by the Russian military in response to what is now a war which officially, in Russian legal terms, is now being partly waged on Russian territory, the 4 regions now having been incorporated in Russia. And this is provoking some unease amongst some people in Russia itself. There's continuing to be growing criticisms of the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. There's complaints about the military leadership, about people like General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, about other military senior members of the Russian military. And there is growing criticism about this, and I think some nervousness about what exactly the Russian military and the Russian government are up to. I mean, it is now a situation where the Russian military have indeed been in retreat for some time, at least through most of September. Russians are reasonably well informed about the situation in and around Bakhmut city, but advances there, that they've, as I said, considerably increased in pace over the last few days, have continued to be incremental. There's been considerable nervousness about the situation in Kherson region in particular, and there is some nervousness about the general situation on the battlefronts. And I repeat what I've said in the past. Opinion polls that I have seen continue to show overwhelming support for the Russian military in its operations in Ukraine. But one has to say this, one does get a sense that where a few weeks ago there was general confidence that things were going according to plan, there's much more nervousness about this in Russia today. Now, to be very clear, if Bakhmut is, as the Russians would say, liberated, if the artillery shelling of Donetsk city ends as following the encirclement and capture of Avdiivka, if all that happens over the next few weeks, all this nervousness in Russia itself will be rapidly dispelled. And having said that, it's important to say that this hasn't happened so far, and this is a nervous and edgy time in Russia. And I have to say that Putin and the Kremlin seem to be acting with immense confidence about the solidity of their political position in Russia, perhaps even, some might say, with a certain measure of complacency, given that they don't seem to be acknowledging the fact that this nervousness exists. I have to assume that they are more familiar with the military realities, and presumably they are aware of the advances that are taking place around Bakhmut city and of the importance of the battle that is being fought there, and that they also are confident that the line is going to hold in Kherson and in other places. But those in Russia who are looking at this from the sidelines, and the Russian population is following the facts of this war with great detail, especially since mobilization was announced 2 weeks ago. Anyway, as one can imagine, there's a lot of biting of fingernails and worrying about this, and I can't help but think that perhaps the Russian government might be doing more to calm these nerves and to allay these concerns, even as they continue to mount. I have to say, it does remind me very much of the situation in Ukraine in the battle in Donbass in 2014. Ukraine also managed a breakthrough in June 2014 when it captured the towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and other places like Liman, for example, and advanced all the way up to Donetsk and looked at one point as if it was going to encircle Donetsk. And Ukraine, as I well remember, seemed to be pressing forward with this offensive for something like 2.5 months. And there was growing stress about this in Russia, fears that Donbass was about to fall, that Donbass was going to be overrun by Ukraine, and again, murmurings that the Russian government and the Russian military were allowing this to happen. And then in mid-August, suddenly, everything changed. A counteroffensive, a pro-Russian counteroffensive, undoubtedly assisted by Russia itself. The exact extent of Russian military involvement in what happened has always been disputed. I'm not going to revisit that issue, but it was undoubtedly heavily assisted and organized by Russia. Anyway, a pro-Russian counteroffensive was launched towards the end of August, and the entire situation suddenly and dramatically reversed, and the mood, as I remember, lifted. Well, perhaps, quite probably, we are in a similar situation now. But in the meantime, there is that we are at the moment in Russia during a period of stress. And by the way, I've noticed that on a thread on another video in which I've ventilated this topic, someone has come out and said that I'm just assuming that this is the truth about this nervousness. I'm afraid I'm not. If you follow the Russian media, which I do, if you follow Russian talk shows, which I also do, you will know that that nervousness is indeed there and is being articulated by more and more people. So anyway, putting all this to aside, let's wait and see what happens over the next few weeks. Anyway, this extraordinary calm in Moscow contrasts amazingly with the strange hysteria in Washington. We've now had this bizarre speech, this very wild speech, in which President Biden has been talking about the dangers of a nuclear confrontation and how we're closer to a Cuban Missile Crisis situation than we've ever been up to now, and the urgent need to find an off-ramp for President Putin. And I have to say, I mean, it's bizarre to contrast this with, as I said, this atmosphere of calm within the Kremlin and within official Moscow. I mean, to reiterate again, the Russians have at no point ever said that they have any plans to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. All the talk about this has been coming from Western sources. So Russian leaders have talked about circumstances in which nuclear weapons might be used by Russia, but in every case that I have seen, it's clear that this would be done in response to military action by the Western powers. So I can't honestly see that this is a real danger, the one that people have been talking about and discussing. So why is President Biden talking in this extreme and exaggerated way? Well, I don't entirely know. Maybe he's mirror imaging. Maybe he's the person who's, maybe it's in the United States that people are thinking about nuclear weapons all the time, certainly would seem so. Maybe he's been rattled by the OPEC Plus decision to cut oil production and is worried that it might be difficult to hold the Western alliance together through the winter months, the difficult winter months, as energy costs soar in Europe, and with rumours now even in Britain of blackouts over the course of the winter. Maybe he's raising the spectre of nuclear war in order to scare people in Moscow, in Russia itself, in order to try to get them to, well, presumably take some kind of action against President Putin, who President Biden seems to be thinking is some sort of dangerous, reckless gambler who is, at the end of his tether in some ways. But anyway, regardless of that, it is very bizarre. It does seem very bizarre to contrast the sort of nuclear hysteria in Washington with this silent, steady calm in Moscow. Now, that does, of course, as I said, beg many questions. But I will say this, given that it's President Biden who is talking about the real danger of nuclear Armageddon, somebody who's looking at this situation from a distance might feel that it is he, Biden, who is becoming increasingly nervous and frightened in this situation, as opposed to Putin, who, as I said, has been handing out lectures about the importance of respecting Ukrainian language and culture in the 4 regions which have now become a part of Russia. Maybe it's the person who talks about nuclear Armageddon who is the one who is really nervous and frightened, rather than the one who does not. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, Putin hasn't only been talking about respect for Ukrainian language and culture. He held a meeting with his economic advisors and discussed the state of the Russian economy. And what he had to say was interesting, and what he had to say also was important. He said, or at least he claimed, I have no independent way of verifying this, that industrial production in Russia has now fully recovered and is back to the levels of 2021. Now that, by the way, if it's true, completely contradicts all assumptions that were being made for weeks and months after the imposition of Western sanctions in February and March. I can remember that a lot of people expected the Russian economy to crater after the sanctions were imposed. And then when that didn't happen, I read a whole series of articles claiming that production would collapse in June when supposedly stocks of spare parts imported from the West ran out and Russian industry was no longer able to keep going without those spare parts. Well, June has come and gone, and according to Putin, most sectors of the Russian industrial economy are experiencing an upswing. He did admit that there were some areas where that wasn't true. The car industry is apparently also experiencing an upswing, but it's certainly not up to 2021 levels and is in fact well short of those. The export industries, by which he means the oil and gas sector, they have also continued to register declines. But other parts of the industrial economy, according to Putin, are now recovering, and overall industrial production is back up to 2021 levels. I have to say, if that is the case, and I have no reason to doubt what Putin says, that is remarkable and astonishing. Putin also said that tax revenue from the non-oil and gas side of the economy is now rising and is to some extent substituting for any falls in receipts from oil and gas revenue. He also said that inflation, that prices, not just inflation, but prices are now continuing to fall. Inflation in Russia is now down to 13%. It seems likely that it will either hit the target, the expected figure of 12% for the entire year by the end of the year, or perhaps it might even fall lower than that. Putin didn't say that everything was going well with the economy. He said that there continues to be a fall in consumer demand and that this is now the main problem. And he's looking for ways to keep consumer demand, to reverse this fall and to sustain demand over the next few months, which is interesting and remarkable in itself, because if the problem is one of falling demand, then that suggests that there is not a problem in supply, which is another reason to think that what he's saying about industrial production being strong is true. All of this is very remarkable and very extraordinary, but it is consistent with the total economic numbers from Russia that we are seeing. I mean, it does seem to be supported by anecdotal and other evidence from the ground. Well, there we are. That's the situation in this extraordinary and very confusing conflict as it stands at the moment. That's my assessment of the state of the battlefronts. We'll see whether Ukraine does launch any more offensives, whether this drive from Zaporozhye really does take place, what happens in Bakhmut and around Donetsk city. We will see also whether Putin's claims about the Russian economy are true. I suspect they are, by the way, and how the West deals with its mounting economic problems. But obviously this is a continuing issue. I'll have to discuss it in further programs, and that's me for the day. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us now on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and also now Rockfin. We now have a new platform, which is Rockfin, where you can find us, and where we will also be publishing exclusive content, by the way. And please also remember that you can support our work if you via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Look at all the great things that we have there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.